What's going on, family? It's King Sick back for another episode of Get On Code. And if you don't know the code, boy, you're in the right place today. So the code essentially is not actually something that I take credit for. It belongs to a man by the name of Neely Fuller Jr. He has a beautiful book. Please go check it out. It's the compensatory code to essentially counter racism. And Mr. Fuller believes in a code and espouses a code that to some great degree inspired even Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, one of our greatest black intellectuals. And so essentially what the code shows you that the 9 and some say 10 areas, if you include healthcare, of people activity, so things that people do, interact, things that control day-to-day life and day-to-day functions. These things are controlled and dominated by the system of white supremacy and manipulated as well. And so, the things are such as language, law, education, entertainment, and so on and so forth. And when you look at all of the areas of people activity, and you see that, yes, they all have that common thread, that these are places, whether it's in the media, and something racist happened, and it was a member of the media who did it, or a news agency who allowed it, or ran the story, or did whatever it was, but essentially it was the media. Or you have those incidences like with the Gucci sweater, and fashion becomes racist, either for not having blacks on cover, or the way they were depicted when they were in the magazines, whether they're print or online, etc. The way black people and black life is presented was somehow racist, or not included, or underpaid. But in some ways, obviously under the control of white supremacy. And so when you look at the different areas like sport, with Colin Kaepernick gets on a knee, and it causes such a backlash and an outrage. And so there we have in sports, we see that it is dominated and controlled by white males specifically, and obviously white supremacy. And so what other examples can you use? Tuskegee experiment, where people systematically, were essentially used as guinea pigs. You can go back to the origin of the gynecology field of study. Slave women were abused in such horrible ways that you wouldn't even want to describe or think of. And so that literally led to the beginning of an entire discipline of medicine, was these poor, unfortunate, enslaved women who had, obviously no choice but to be essentially, again, guinea pigs. So when you look at all of the areas of people activity and all of these examples that I've given you, you'll see that when you live in a dynamic that seems to have a code to oppress you, well then it is definitely incumbent upon the people who are being oppressed that one must respond with a code as well. Because to be in a system that has codified behavior and not have codified behavior, obviously the system, essentially is going to swallow you up. Now there might be some lucky ones who don't follow a code, who slip through the cracks, win a lottery scratch off after being a bum outside of a gas station for 10 years. I don't know. But for the most part, if a system is acting in code, even that person who may slip through the cracks and be the 1 in a million who get out of these impoverished circumstances and conditions of racism and what they do to people's communities, neighborhoods, and oftentimes in places like Chicago and Baltimore, whole cities of people are affected by crime and drugs and just the second-class citizenship that is black citizenship in the United States of America Corporation. So when you take this control that is wielded over black people, African people, people of color, etc., and you kind of put it into this codified language, and you respond to it or you understand it as such. And so when you see these microaggressions, whether it's the Botham Jean case where the judge, got out of line. There was a sheriff's deputy who seemed to do things that were unbecoming of a sheriff's deputy, at least where I've seen them treat their own people, black folks. And that's not even to include the brother of Botham Jean in the way that he responded to the murderer Amber Geiger disgraced former police officer and went over and gave her this celebratory hug as if to say, this great weight is lifted off my shoulder because I don't hate you for murdering my brother for no reason at all. Now, if that was a personal thing, that a personal moment that they maybe have enjoyed behind closed doors or, something of that nature, that'd be different. But for it to be during this, this spectacle that was this trial, I really feel sorry for, all black people having to watch that, because that's racial battle fatigue. That's racial battle fatigue when you see people do things that just don't they're inexplicable. Inexplicable. There would be so much of a great undertone of racial hatred towards a black officer if the roles were reversed. In the minds of white supremacy, they would really reconsider hiring the next black officer, because at the end of the day, this is a place where they have centralized and localized white supremacy power. They are the enforcement arm of white supremacy. And so, again, the code is very important when it comes to people understanding how to navigate this world of racism. It'll definitely inspire you to ask more questions, because we as African people, we don't ask enough questions. Why is this New Year's Day? How many years? 2020 AD, after the death of the person that they gave you during slavery, right? The story that they gave you during slavery, the timeline that fits a white supremacist narrative, in essence, that it seems to mute all of the great historical past of Kemet, Nubia, Kush, and other places in East and West, South and Central Africa. You see, and even the correlation to the to the Americas, that is as historical as anything else when you consider the Olmecs, etc., being the progenitors of people like the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas, who we praise because they're a little bit more, long straight hair as opposed to nappy kinky hair. Still dark people, but a little bit more pleasing and a little bit more friendly to the narrative of white supremacy, that you Africans have not contributed anything to the world. And so that is the beauty of saying that this is New Year's, is you're accepting the fact, essentially, that Africans have contributed nothing. We don't have the calendar. The calendar has gone from an African calendar, an Egyptian Kemetic calendar, to a Greek calendar, to a Roman calendar, to a Julian calendar, and all of these different people have taken over the calendar to now the Gregorian calendar. That comes from essentially Rome, which is essentially the Byzantine Empire, right? And so when you understand that Rome came after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and they were forced to essentially retreat their power base of the Byzantine to Rome, and then established really the strength of the church from Rome and the Vatican itself. And so people have to understand that there was a time when Rome had actually colonized Britain. At that time it was called Briton. Now Great Britain is who these folks are. And so the ultimate colonizers historically being the Greco-Romans, and for them to essentially colonize the Britons, Britons, who were a ruddy-looking people, much darker than what we perceive the predecessors of the Britons to be. And so if you are one of those fortunate people who've heard stories that the original people of Europe were black, or the original people of Britain were black, or England were black, this is where this comes from. And it's very much true. So when you look at the history here of the colonization of the Romans, of the Britons, there are great stories from history to draw on. I always like to look at Tacitus and Calgacus, because in the story, essentially what was being kind of given to the audience was this, is that when you are oppressing someone, sure, I mean, it's obvious we're oppressing you, and so we have to allow for a certain amount of resistance to kind of allow the people's emotions to bubble and for them to get out that little bit of frustration because we are oppressing them. And they know this. But if we control the aggression, if we give them a message in such a way that we allow for an MLK or a Malcolm X or an Elijah Muhammad or a Marcus Garvey to incite people just a little, it's good as long as we control it. But it's bad when the people could essentially control and contain their own emotions and take them in directions in which white supremacy cannot control. That's what, white supremacy cannot have, is a movement of black people that is organic of the people, because then that they don't control. And so, again, going back to the code, that's why when we discuss black celebrities and some of the, essentially agendas that you see black celebrities pushing, or stories that they're involved in, and the narratives that kind of fall from them, whether it's the Deontay Wilder fallout and the sort of racial undertone that's taken, although there was racial undertones to it from, when he said "to this day." And I think a lot of people have, kind of neglected to mention the fact that, this was about race to a certain extent. And in the fallout, I think that what has happened is that Deontay Wilder didn't put in the work. He did not grow, mature. He didn't add anything on to his game. He went into a fight the same fighter he was when he walked out of the last fight with the same guy he fought, right? And so at the end of the day, what you have to understand is that when you look at this from a perspective of a code, the code allows us to see through all of this mud on issues like this. It allows us to see through the agenda of things like the Gayle Kings and the Oprah Winfreys of the world. It allows us to see through the cloudy glass when we're dealing with issues like the knackers of LA, the LA knackers. So what we have is to really adopt this codified thinking and this codified paper, this behavior, and it's not something that's written down necessarily on paper. As, of course, Mr. Neely Fuller has this book, but it's just an understanding of white supremacy and how it functions. A white person says something like, yeah, I have a black this or a black friend, or, somehow proximity to blackness makes you a non-racist. So whatever the racist thing is that you just said, now you're going to clean it up like Clorox with saying, I am this close to black people. And they don't say the blank that's after that, which is, so I can't be racist. When they might say something racist, well, why does her hair look like that anyway? So if they wanted to cut it off, well, if the hair doesn't look nice, well, you don't know the cultural importance of the hair and this and that, and you potentially shouldn't even say anything in the debate, is what someone would say, right? How dare you? And again, we go back to the proximity of blackness. Well, I have a black friend named so-and-so, and they said and this and that, so I can't be racist. I'm saying what a black person said. There's another that that white folks will use when in a situation where their racist behavior has been called out, or they have been essentially exposed as having these racist tendencies, which is completely normal for white people to have. It is completely normal for a white individual to have racist concepts and ideas about black people. Why? Well, hell, if the things that you see on TV that black people get all upset about, there are thousands more that are so subtle that even black folks didn't know that there was an agenda with a movie like Color Purple, where we take Danny Glover and essentially we pluck him in the place of the white slave master who had been doing all of those sexually deviant, disgusting, foul, and invasive violations of black womanhood since they showed up on the shores and began this dynamic and began this relationship. And so in order to psychologically remove the blame or the guilt or the antipathy that black women would feel towards white men, to further their agenda and separation of black consciousness between the female consciousness and the male consciousness, this was kind of the final stone that had to be removed from the foundation of the black family psychologically, right? Of course, there are still, healthy black relationships that exist, but in the masses, you can see, through the statistics and see the numbers of children who were born in two-parent homes, way back when and then now today. And it's a dramatic increase in single-parent homes. I think something like 7% of African-American children born in 1960, 64 were born to two-parent homes. And currently, it's about 63% of homes are single mothers raising children. Children are born to homes of single mothers, 60-something% of the time. So it's just a drastic, exponential increase. And so you go back to the code and why it's important to supplant this white guilt and this white face from these stories. That's a part of the code. And so when you look and you see now black women and black men online and social media spaces and even maybe in real life having these debates and these back and forths about what black man ain't doing and what black woman ain't doing. But we're not talking about Jimmys and Joes. We're talking about, these hypothetical situations. We're talking these statistics. That's what we're talking. We're not talking boots on the ground, because you show me your local high school, your local junior high, your local elementary school, your local basketball, and all the different little sports. Now let's go out there and, man, who are these daddies out here? Who are all these men that's coaching these games? That's posting these videos? That's out here with their sons? Come on, there are too many fathers out here putting in work. There are too many dudes who couldn't play basketball nearly as good as Kobe Bryant, and they was coaching basketball, flying all over the place with these kids for years, and we haven't given credit to black men for being in the lives of a lot of these athletes, a lot of these kids, and it's really an agenda to take consciously the contributions of black men and continually and consistently minimize them, because they have been on an economic scale in the 60s, 50s and 60s, when you could see the decline of the black industrial inner cities and factories and places that had been the backbone, essentially, of the migration north for black folks. So when you see the depressed conditions of a lot of the places up north, Philly and Baltimore, Detroit, Flint, Michigan, and a lot of other places that, were making a lot of money, whether it was through the automakers or tire makers or steel and other industries, that black folks was working these jobs. This is how they had got those homes, those places that they were living. A lot of times when you look back at those stories of the civil rights movement, and the sisters had on nice dresses and they even had nice little cars sometimes, nice little hats they wore to church with the white gloves. They had nice furniture in the home when they would go in and interview these black families. And so we have to understand that this is how our people were climbing into the middle class. So as those jobs began to divest out of our communities and go overseas to places like Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, that's when you begin to see also a migration of those folks to this country, living better than ADOS, foundational black Americans, living better than the African Americans who are here, even those from the diaspora that may have moved to America who don't have lineage necessarily to America or American slavery and Jim Crow. But the point is that this code of white supremacy has operated as such that it has created this divide between black men and black women that now today is so wide, it's about as wide as the racial wealth gap. But then when you take and walk it back, you have to say to yourself, 86% of black men are married to black women. So hold up. That's insane when you look back and you think that still black woman, 86% of the time, the man who's going to keep you for life is a black man that we are out here beating to hell. And black women are the least married women in our society. And yet and still, the man who marries you the most 86% of the time at my last check was black men. So we're committing generational suicide when we continue to allow the code of white supremacy and the codified nature of white supremacy to be the way that we then think and then react to one another. We can't allow external forces to be essentially what we have in as fuel in our minds and our brains is what has been pumped into there by external forces and sources, because it will always be to manipulate you. People aren't going to waste their time trying to get you to think something if it's going to be beneficial for you and your people. We live in a competitive environment. And I think black people understand that when they're in the hood, being competitive, over streets and turfs and territories. But when facing the one system that has proven to be undefeated against your black selves, we completely don't even pay them any attention. We will ride down the street and be like, ain't that the song? That's the boys from what's her name side of town. Yeah, they had did this thing to the homeboy so and so and so. And so now we're going to ride on them. But the whole entire community that you living in that's so depressed and so disgusting that you have nothing better to do than to war and feud with other poor people who are also being oppressed in the very same messed up conditions under the same male-less environment where the black man has been systematically removed from your community. Systematically by the government removed from your community. Systematically. The system did it. And the system did it in a compassionate effort, so to speak, or at least that was the attempt, and that's what it was supposed to come across as to us, and obviously it did. We fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. Now, man, because the black man can't get a job, what we need to do is create these housing projects and, these tenement buildings. And what we'll do is we'll just, let the women and the children live there and let the men fend for themselves. So somehow we thought that the best social service that we could offer to a family was to find ways to separate that family. And if we don't continue to say that out loud, we will continue to blame ourselves for a place that we exist on a hierarchy of socialization that we had no control over. We had control, but once we gave ourselves to the Democratic Party, once we gave ourselves to the white liberals who essentially said, if you vote for us, we'll stop lynching you, the lynching became different. And it's just a different lynching. And so we have to wake up. Election 2020 is around the corner. We have to continue to gain a political education. We have to continue to go into our communities and ask ourselves, is the ballot going to cut that lady's grass across the street? Is the ballot going to put new paint on the business that's been in our community for 20 or 30 years? Is the ballot going to make create a fund for small businesses to be able to thrive in places that other businesses from other communities exist and are making a very handsome reward for their location and also the financing that is behind their building and the edifice itself. And it just creates an experience for the consumer where it's a no-brainer. Do I want to go look at some depressed building that was built in the 40s and 50s when black folks had some unity about themselves and has now been run down, or do I want to go to this brand new brick building that looks, obviously we know what choice a person is going to make. So get on code. I wanted to break down the code so people really understand where I'm coming from. Again, check out the book, Neely Fuller Jr. It's a great book. Highly recommend it. Sending nothing but love vibrations to the people. Stay in your higher self. Resist the temptations of the lower self. Remove yourself from people and individuals around you that are trying to drag you into a lower self mentality and condition. Your spirit is all you have. We're trying to raise our frequency and raise our vibration as a people. And the only way we can do that is we have to turn off the garbage and we have to plug in with some real gas. And that's global African supremacy. And when you plug into some gas and get off of that banana fuel and get off of that crackatosis and that niggeritis that we seem to be suffering from, my brother said, he says all the time, I think we would be going in a positive direction. Love, family. Make sure you check me out on Facebook at King Sick, at KINGSIIK, on YouTube. Catch me at Sick Music, SIIKMUZIK, at King Sick on Reverb Nation and SoundCloud, X King Sick X on Twitter.com. Get on code, stay in the movement.